The Orion's wake was dying. Captain Elias Reid stood on the shattered bridge, gripping the edge of the navigation console as red emergency lights pulsed across the ruined command deck. Sparks rained from severed conduits, and the acrid stench of burning circuits filled the air. Outside, through the cracked viewport, the massive battleship of the Zyari Dominion loomed, its sleek black hull reflecting the dying embers of the Orion's wake's final stand. "Captain!" Lieutenant Corrin staggered to his side, his face smeared with soot and blood. "Shields are down. Weapons are offline. We've lost engine control." "I can see that, Lieutenant," Reid cut in, his voice hoarse. The ship's heartbeat was faltering, its final breath slipping away. His crew had fought fiercely, but the Zyari fleet was relentless. The comm crackled. A cold voice, precise and measured, cut through the static. "Captain Elias Reid of the Terran Federation vessel Orion's Wake. This is High Admiral Vorzith of the Zyari Dominion. Your vessel is crippled. Surrender immediately, and your crew will be spared." A silent dread filled the bridge. The Zyari were known for their ruthless efficiency, their empire expanding through calculated subjugation. There were no guarantees in their mercy, only cold pragmatism. Reid's mind raced. His options were vanishing. His crew was his responsibility, and their lives now hung in the balance. He took a deep breath and activated the transmission. "This is Captain Reid." His voice was steady, though his stomach twisted. "If I surrender myself, will you let my crew go?" A pause. Then Vorzith's voice returned. "An acceptable arrangement." Reid exhaled slowly. "Then I accept." The bridge was silent. Corrin's jaw tightened, and others looked at him with wide eyes, but no one spoke. They all understood what he was doing. Minutes later, Reid stood in the airlock, flanked by two armed Zyari guards clad in black exo-armor. Behind him, the Orion's wake drifted, powerless but intact. His crew would live. That was all that mattered. As the airlock cycled shut, he knew one thing with certainty: his freedom was gone. The Zyari flagship, Drexera, was a fortress of polished obsidian metal and shimmering force fields, its corridors lined with glowing conduits that pulsed with an eerie blue light. The air smelled sterile, as if scrubbed of anything organic. Reid was led through the ship, his hands bound by an energy restraint, though his captors did not bother with excessive force. He had surrendered willingly. That gave him some leverage, at least for now. Finally, they reached an ornate doorway adorned with intricate silver etchings that resembled swirling constellations. The guards exchanged a silent signal before the door slid open. The room beyond was nothing like he expected. Instead of a cold interrogation chamber or a sterile prison cell, he found himself in a vast chamber bathed in the soft glow of violet bioluminescent plants. Delicate tapestries adorned the walls, and an array of transparent data displays hovered in midair, filled with shifting alien symbols. At the center of the chamber stood a woman, Princess Lirena. She was taller than most human women, with luminous silver hair cascading past her shoulders and deep violet eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light. A delicate circlet of black metal rested upon her forehead, and her form-fitting midnight blue gown shimmered like liquid stardust. "You are Captain Elias Reid," she said, her voice smooth but carrying an unspoken weight. Reid met her gaze without flinching. "And you are Princess Lirena of the Zyari Dominion." A flicker of something, amusement, sadness, crossed her face. "You surrendered yourself to save your crew," she said, stepping closer. "That was unexpected." "You don't know much about humans, do you?" he replied. Her lips curved slightly. "I know enough." A tense silence stretched between them before she spoke again. "You are not a prisoner, Captain Reid. Not yet. My father, High Admiral Vorzith, has plans for you. Until then, you will remain under my watch." Her watch? That was unexpected. And what exactly does that entail? She tilted her head slightly, her violet eyes studying him. "That depends on you." For the first time since stepping aboard this ship, Reid felt something shift in the air. A tension beneath the surface, an unspoken truth lingering just beyond reach. Lirena was hiding something, and whatever it was, it could be the key to his survival. Days passed, and Reid quickly realized that Lirena was unlike the Zyari he had encountered before. While she carried herself with the elegance of royalty, there was a guarded nature to her movements, a wariness in her gaze when she thought no one was watching. And then there were the rumors. Through careful observation and whispered exchanges with the lower-ranking Zyari who maintained the ship, Reid pieced together fragments of an unsettling truth. Lirena was not the obedient daughter her father believed her to be. She was plotting against him. The confirmation came one night when she led him through a hidden passage within her private chambers. The walls pulsed with faint golden light, and at the end of the corridor, they emerged into a concealed chamber where a half-dozen Zyari rebels were gathered. "This is Captain Reid," Lirena announced. "He may be the ally we need." The rebels studied him warily. Their leader, a scarred Zyari male named Zaurek, folded his arms. "Why should we trust him?" "Because he surrendered himself to save his people," Lirena said. "That is not the mark of a coward. It is the mark of someone who values life over conquest." Zaurek grunted, but said nothing. Reid stepped forward. "I want to know the truth. Why are you fighting against your own empire?" Lirena hesitated. Then, taking a deep breath, she spoke the words that changed everything. "My father is a monster," she said quietly, "and I am his greatest experiment." Reid's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" She lifted her hands, and for the first time, he noticed the faint shimmer of energy surrounding her fingers. Then, a pulse of raw, invisible force rippled through the chamber. The walls trembled. The air grew thick. "My psychic abilities were not a gift," she whispered. "They were engineered." Reid's heart pounded. The implications were staggering. "My father has spent years experimenting on me," Lirena continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Enhancing my powers, controlling them. If he succeeds, he will use me to subjugate entire star systems." She turned to him, her violet eyes burning. "But if we stand together, we can stop him." Reid inhaled sharply. He had sworn to protect his crew. That oath had led him here. And now, against all reason, he found himself staring into the eyes of a princess who had every reason to betray him, yet was asking for his trust instead. A rebellion, a tyrant, a secret power beyond imagination. He had already sacrificed his freedom to save his crew. Would he now risk everything to save her? Reid stared at Lirena, the weight of her revelation pressing against his chest like the gravity of a dying star. Engineered psychic abilities. Experiments. A tyrannical father who sought to wield her like a living weapon. It was worse than he had imagined. And now, she was asking for his help. The silence stretched as the rebels in the chamber shifted uneasily. Zaurek's dark eyes narrowed. "He's hesitating," Zaurek said, his voice laced with suspicion. "He's still loyal to the Federation. Humans don't fight for anyone but their own." Reid shot him a glare. "That's not true." Lirena watched him closely, waiting for his decision. Reid exhaled sharply. He had already surrendered himself to the Zyari to protect his crew. That choice had been easy, necessary. But this was stepping into the unknown. If he sided with Lirena, he was committing to an insurrection against one of the most feared military empires in the known galaxy. He would become a traitor in the eyes of the Zyari Dominion, hunted by the High Admiral's forces. But could he really stand by and let her be used as a weapon of conquest? His fists clenched. "No. Tell me what you need me to do," Reid said finally. Lirena's gaze softened, and something flickered in her expression. Relief, perhaps, or gratitude. Zaurek exhaled sharply through his nose, unconvinced but willing to tolerate him for now. "This is suicide," he muttered. Lirena ignored him. She stepped closer to Reid, her voice dropping to a hushed tone. "My father trusts me, but only to a point. He's watching my every move. If we make a single mistake, he will erase us before we ever become a threat." Reid nodded grimly. "Then let's make sure we don't make mistakes." Lirena led Reid deeper into the secret passageways of the Drexura, its hidden corridors a stark contrast to the sleek, pristine halls above. Here, the walls were older, lined with conduits pulsing with ancient energy, forgotten parts of the ship that had been sealed off from common access. "This vessel is over a century old," Lirena explained as they moved through the dimly lit pathways. "It was one of the first Dominion dreadnoughts ever built. Many of its secrets have been buried beneath years of upgrades and modifications, but I know its true design." Reid ran a hand along the cold metal walls. "You've been planning this for a long time." "Since I was old enough to understand what my father truly is," she admitted. "At first, I thought if I played the obedient daughter, you would let me be. But the moment my powers manifested, he saw me as something more, a tool for conquest." She turned to face him. "You've seen what I can do, but that was only a fraction of my abilities. My father has enhanced me. The way she said it sent a chill down Reid's spine. What did he do to you? He asked. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached up and touched the black circlet resting on her forehead. This, she whispered, is not a symbol of royalty. It's a restraint. A limiter. Reid's pulse quickened. A limiter? Lirena nodded. Without it, my mind would be untethered. My powers would be uncontrollable. My father has spent years fine-tuning the enhancements he forced upon me. If this device is ever removed. She trailed off, and for the first time since meeting her, Reid saw something in her eyes that unsettled him. Fear. Then we don't remove it, he said carefully. Lirena looked away. One day, I may not have a choice. A heavy silence fell between them before she pushed forward. Come. There's something I need to show you. They walked in silence for several more minutes until they arrived at a large, sealed bulkhead. Lirena placed her hand on a control panel, and a soft hum resonated through the walls as the door slid open. Beyond it lay a hidden chamber, and what Reid saw inside made his breath hitch. Rows upon rows of cylindrical stasis pods lined the walls, each one containing a figure suspended in an eerie blue liquid. Some were Zyari. Others were human. My father's test subjects, Lirena murmured. Reid stepped closer to one of the pods, his stomach turning. A human male, no older than 25, floated lifelessly within. Electrodes were attached to his skull, his expression frozen in a state of pain. This is what he's been doing? Reid's voice was barely more than a whisper. Lirena nodded. He's been experimenting on anyone with psychic potential, human or Zyari. He believes he can create an army of beings like me. He doesn't just want to rule the Dominion, Captain. He wants to rule the entire galaxy. Reid's hands curled into fists. Then we stop him. Lirena turned to him, violet eyes burning with quiet intensity. Yes, we do. The plan was set in motion. Lirena's rebellion was small, but it had potential. Zalrek and his fighters controlled key areas of the Drexra's underbelly, giving them access to parts of the ship that even the High Admiral's officers had forgotten existed. With careful precision, they began striking at the Dominion's infrastructure, sabotaging key systems, disrupting communication relays, and planting false data trails to keep Vorzith's forces off their scent. Reid proved to be a valuable asset. His tactical mind, honed from years in the Terran Federation's military, gave their scattered resistance much-needed structure. He trained the rebels in guerrilla tactics, teaching them how to exploit the Dominion's blind spots. Days turned into weeks. The rebellion grew bolder. But so did the High Admiral's suspicions. One evening, as Reid and Lirena were reviewing their next operation, a sharp chime echoed through her chambers. The doors hissed open, and two heavily armed Zyari guards entered. Behind them strode a figure Reid had yet to meet in person. High Admiral Vorzith. He was taller than Reid had expected, his presence like a looming shadow. His obsidian-black armor gleamed under the chamber's dim lighting, and his piercing violet eyes, so much like Lirena's, settled on them with quiet calculation. Daughter, he said smoothly. You've been busy. Lirena remained composed. Father, she replied evenly. Vorzith's gaze shifted to Reid. And you, Captain Reid. I must admit, I find your presence here intriguing. Reid held his ground. You agreed to spare my crew in exchange for my surrender. I assumed I would at least have the courtesy of being treated as more than a caged animal. A slow smile touched Vorzith's lips. Oh, but Captain, some animals are far more dangerous when they believe they are free. Reid's stomach tightened. Vorzith knew. And now, the game had changed. The air in Lirena's chamber grew suffocating as High Admiral Vorzith's violet gaze locked on to Reid with unsettling precision. The rebel captain had been in the presence of powerful men before, but Vorzith was something else entirely. He exuded control, a predator circling its prey with quiet amusement. I have been observing you, Captain Reid, Vorzith said, pacing slowly. You surrendered yourself with noble intentions, yet I find it curious. You have not behaved like a prisoner. Reid kept his expression neutral. I was under the impression I was a guest of the Dominion. Vorzith chuckled, a low, calculated sound. A guest does not whisper in the shadows. A guest does not cultivate dissent. He turned his gaze to Lirena, his voice softening, but the danger in it remained. Daughter, you have been distracted. Lirena stood unmoving. I have done everything you asked of me, father. Have you? Vorzith's voice was gentle, almost affectionate, yet it made Reid's skin crawl. Then tell me, my dear, why is it that our security systems have flagged anomalies in several restricted decks? Why have my officers reported missing supplies and inconsistencies in energy readings? Lirena didn't flinch. Perhaps your officers are incompetent. Vorzith smiled, but his eyes darkened. A bold answer. Reid knew they were walking a razor's edge. Vorzith was probing, testing, waiting for one of them to misstep. Then the Admiral's gaze fell on Reid again. Tell me, Captain, how does it feel to fight for someone else's war? Reid didn't rise to the bait. I fight for what I believe in. Ah, Vorzith mused. But do you believe in her? He gestured to Lirena. You barely know my daughter, yet you are willing to throw your fate to the void for her cause? Reid didn't answer. Vorzith stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. You see, Captain, my daughter is very special. You cannot imagine what she is capable of. There was something in the way he said it that sent a chill through Reid. Vorzith turned back to Lirena. And you, my child, cannot imagine the lengths I will go to in order to ensure your loyalty. A long pause. Then Vorzith gestured to his guards. Take Captain Reid to the lower cells. I will deal with him soon. Reid tensed as the soldiers stepped forward, their weapons primed. Lirena inhaled sharply, and for the first time, her composure cracked. Father, wait. Vorzith raised an eyebrow. Lirena's hands curled into fists. Let him go. Vorzith studied her in silence, then exhaled, shaking his head. Ah, my dear Lirena. You disappoint me. And then, without warning, his hand shot forward. Lirena gasped as an invisible force seized her throat, lifting her from the ground. Reid lunged instinctively, but the guards drove the butts of their rifles into his gut, forcing him to his knees. Lirena clawed at the air, her body suspended as if by unseen hands. Her limiter circlet flickered violently, pulses of unstable energy crackling along its surface. Her eyes burned with violet light. Vorzith tilted his head. Do you know why I created that device, my daughter? His voice was almost tender. Because I know what happens when your mind is unshackled. Lirena's body trembled, her energy surging wildly. The air itself vibrated, the walls groaning under some unseen pressure. Enough, Vorzith murmured, releasing her. Lirena collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The room reeked of ozone, the charged remnants of raw psychic energy. Vorzith sighed. I had hoped you would see reason, but I see now that I have been too lenient. He turned to his guards. Take them both. She will learn obedience. As the guards grabbed Reid, he locked eyes with Lirena. This was the moment, and they were out of time. The detention block was deep within the Drexera, a place few ever saw and fewer still returned from. The walls were seamless black, humming with containment fields designed to suppress movement and thought. Reid was thrown into a cell, the energy bars humming to life behind him. Across from him, in a separate chamber, Lirena lay crumpled on the floor, breathing heavily. You okay? He asked. She exhaled sharply. He's escalating. That was him being lenient. A bitter smile. You have no idea. Reid paced. We need to get out of here. You have contacts, people on the inside. Lirena shook her head. Not here. The moment he suspected me, he would have removed any potential allies from this sector. Reid ran a hand through his hair. Then what's our move? Lirena hesitated. There is one way. Reid caught the uncertainty in her voice. I don't like how that sounds. She touched the circlet on her forehead. This device. It limits me. Keeps my power in check. If I remove it, I can break us out. Reid frowned. And what happens to you if you do that? A shadow crossed her face. I don't know. That answer unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Lirena. She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw something raw, something deeply human beneath her controlled exterior. I won't be a prisoner anymore, Elias, she said softly. Before he could stop her, she reached up and grasped the limiter. A moment's hesitation. Then she wrenched it free. A deafening crack split the air. Reid felt it before he saw it. A wave of energy exploded outward, distorting the space around them. The lights flickered violently, and a deep, resonating hum vibrated through the ship's structure. Lirena's body arched as raw psychic force surged through her, violet light spilling from her eyes like liquid fire. The air bent around her, warping under the sheer gravity of her unleashed mind. The energy bars of the cell dissolved in an instant. Reid staggered back, shielding his face from the heat radiating from her form. Lirena. Her voice was layered, reverberating with power. I can feel everything. The ship itself seemed to groan under her influence. The walls rippled, their molecules shifting under an unseen force. And then, her head snapped up. He's coming. Reid followed her gaze toward the entrance. The detention block doors ripped open. And standing there, his black armor gleaming in the flickering light, was High Admiral Vorzith. His expression was unreadable, but there was something dark in his eyes. Amusement. Ah, he murmured. There she is. Lirena's breath hitched, her energy crackling wildly. And in that moment, Reid understood. This was exactly what Vorzith had wanted. The air in the detention block shimmered with the raw energy radiating from Lirena. She stood, her body rigid, her silver hair weightless in the unseen currents of force twisting around her. The violet light in her eyes pulsed wildly, no longer contained by the limiter that once bound her mind. But Vorzith smiled. Reid could barely hear over the humming resonance of her power, but he caught the High Admiral's soft chuckle. Do you feel it, daughter? Vorzith asked, stepping forward, utterly fearless. The weight of all that potential? The raw, unshaped chaos inside you. Lirena's hands curled into fists. The walls of the detention block rippled around them, the molecules shifting under invisible pressure. The metal floor beneath Vorzith's boots buckled, dipping inward like soft clay. Yet the High Admiral remained unfazed. You should not have done that, he murmured. Lirena gasped, her body trembling violently. Reid saw it. Something was wrong. The power coursing through her wasn't stable. Her breaths grew ragged as arcs of violet lightning crackled around her, searing black scars into the walls. You were never meant to control it on your own, Vorzith continued, his tone almost gentle. You need the limiter, Lirena. Without it, your mind will collapse under its own gravity. No, she whispered. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stand taller. You just wanted me to think that. But there was doubt in her voice. Reid took a cautious step toward her. Lirena, listen to me. We need to get out of here, now. Her eyes flicked to him, and for a brief moment, the crackling energy around her dimmed. A flicker of control. Then Vorzith moved. With the precision of a predator striking its wounded prey, he extended his hand and crushed the air around her with his will. Lirena screamed. Her body jerked as an unseen force wrapped around her, compressing her, suffocating her mind with an unbearable psychic weight. The walls convulsed as her uncontrolled power lashed out in response, the floor splitting in jagged lines. Reid lunged. But the moment he moved, he was slammed backward by an invisible pressure, his body colliding hard against the cell wall. He gasped, struggling against the unseen force pinning him like an insect beneath glass. Vorzith never even looked at him. His attention remained fixed on his daughter. You feel it now, don't you? The High Admiral murmured. The burden of a mind too vast, too powerful to sustain itself. The pressure of existence unraveling within you. Lirena trembled, and for the first time, Reid saw something in her eyes that truly terrified him. Panic. Her voice cracked. I can't. Vorzith stepped closer, his expression almost affectionate. Let go, my child, he whispered. Let me bear this weight for you. I can shape you, guide you. Together, we will bring order to the stars. Lirena's body was shaking violently, her mind splitting apart under the weight of its own unleashed power. And then, to Reid's horror, she reached for Vorzith. A single, faltering movement. Her fingers inches from his outstretched hand. No, Reid rasped, struggling against the crushing force pinning him. Lirena, don't. Her glowing violet eyes flicked to him, uncertain, desperate. Vorzith's smile deepened. She belongs to me, Captain Reid, the High Admiral murmured. She always has. Lirena's breath hitched, and the ship shuddered. The entire Drexera rocked violently as a deep boom thundered through the walls. The emergency lighting flickered as klaxons blared, their piercing wails drowning out everything else. An external attack. Reid barely had time to register what was happening before a metallic shriek echoed from above, and a section of the ceiling collapsed. Reid hit the ground hard as debris rained around him. A massive explosion somewhere in the ship had torn through the detention block's upper levels, sending a firestorm of wreckage cascading downward. Smoke filled the chamber, the acrid stench of burning metal thick in the air. Somewhere in the chaos, Vorzith's psychic hold on them broke. Reid coughed, rolling onto his side. His vision swam, his body aching from the impact. Lirena was on her knees, gasping for breath, her energy fluctuating wildly. Sparks crackled across her fingertips, her body barely able to contain the raging storm within. Vorzith, half buried beneath a twisted slab of metal, pushed himself up. His face was bruised, but his eyes still burned with dangerous intensity. That, he muttered, was unexpected. Another boom rattled the ship. Through the gaping hole in the ceiling, Reid caught glimpses of the outside, ships. A battle. Orion's wake, he realized. His crew was attacking the dreadnought. Lirena. Reid staggered toward her, reaching for her arm. We need to move. She was trembling, still struggling to control the raging power inside her. Her eyes flickered between him and her father, who was now rising to his feet, his aura swelling with barely restrained fury. You think this changes anything? Vorzith snarled, brushing soot from his armor. You think your pathetic rebellion can break me? Reid pulled Lirena up. We're done talking. Let's go. For a moment, she hesitated, then nodded. Reid grabbed a fallen rifle from one of the dead guards and turned toward the exit. But before they could move, Vorzith raised his hand, and the world twisted again. A shock wave of force slammed into them, sending them crashing against the far wall. Reid barely had time to react before Vorzith was upon them, his movements impossibly fast, his hand seizing Lirena's wrist with inhuman strength. You are not leaving me, daughter, he hissed. Lirena gasped, her body writhing in pain as his psychic influence wrapped around her like unbreakable chains. Her eyes widened in horror. And then, something snapped. Not in her. In him. Vorzith's body jerked, his eyes going wide. His grip faltered. He staggered back, his breath hitching. Reid barely understood what he was seeing, until he saw the fractures. Cracks were forming along Vorzith's body, jagged veins of violet light spiderwebbing across his skin. His expression twisted in shock. Lirena was still trembling, but her eyes were calm. You made a mistake, father, she whispered. Vorzith's lips parted. And then, he screamed. His body imploded. A massive pulse of energy erupted outward as his form was consumed in raw psychic collapse. The shockwave sent Reid and Lirena flying once more, the walls ripping apart from the force. Then, silence. Reid lay still, breathing hard. The smoke was thick, the room barely holding itself together. Lirena was kneeling, her shoulders rising and falling. Slowly, she lifted her head. Vorzith was gone. Reid swallowed hard. You killed him. Lirena looked at him, her violet eyes dimming. No. Her voice was quiet. He's still inside me. Reid's blood ran cold. And outside, the Drexera continued to burn. The Drexera was dying. Beyond the shattered walls of the detention block, klaxons blared in panicked discord. Somewhere above, the hull had been breached, and the artificial gravity flickered in and out of stability. The massive dreadnought groaned like a wounded beast, its ancient frame struggling to hold itself together under the relentless bombardment from the Orion's wake. But inside the ruined cell, Reid wasn't thinking about the battle raging outside. He was staring at Lirena. She was still kneeling in the debris, her silver hair tangled, her hands curled into the metal floor. The violet glow in her eyes had dimmed, but something deeper lurked beneath the surface, something fractured, something wrong. You said he's still inside you, Reid rasped. His voice was hoarse, his lungs burning from the smoke. What the hell does that mean? Lirena's fingers twitched. She swallowed hard, as if trying to force words through a throat too tight with dread. I don't know. But she did. Reid could see it in the way she shivered, in the way her hands flexed involuntarily, as if fighting off some invisible restraint. The memory of Vorzith's death was still burned into his vision, the way he had imploded, vanishing into cracks of violet energy, his presence winking out like a star swallowed by a black hole. Except he hadn't gone. Reid took a cautious step closer. Lirena. She flinched. And then, she laughed. It was soft at first, a breathless chuckle, barely more than a whisper. But then it deepened, distorting, turning into something wrong. Reid's blood ran cold. The laughter wasn't hers. Lirena exhaled shakily, pressing a hand to her temple. No, 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 no. Her fingers dug into her skull. Get out of my head. Reid's heart pounded. Lirena, talk to me. Her breath hitched, her body shuddering. She squeezed her eyes shut, but when they snapped open again, they weren't hers. A deep, unnatural violet bled into the irises, an otherworldly glow twisting behind her gaze. Her lips curled, but the expression was not her own. And when she spoke, it was his voice. Oh, my dear Captain. Reid stumbled back, his pulse hammering. You didn't really think it would be that easy, did you? Lirena, or whatever had become of her, tilted her head, a cruel amusement flickering across her features. I made her powerful. Vorzith's voice purred through her lips. And now? She is mine. Reid's hands curled into fists. Like hell she is. He grabbed the rifle from his back and leveled it at her. Lirena's body twitched. Then in a blur of motion, she was in front of him, her hand gripping the barrel. The metal melted under her fingers. Reid barely had time to react before an invisible force threw him backward, slamming him against the broken wall. Pain exploded through his ribs. Vorzith. No. Lirena tilted her head again, watching him with the fascination of a predator toying with prey. You can't fight me, Captain, the voice mused. You couldn't even fight me when I was flesh and blood. And now? I am so much more. Reid gritted his teeth. I don't believe in ghosts. Oh, but you should. Lirena's fingers twitched, and then she froze. A sharp, pained gasp tore from her throat. Her body jerked, her hands clawing at her head. No, no, I won't. For a fraction of a second, Reid saw it. The war inside her. Her body trembled violently, flickers of violet and silver light clashing against each other in chaotic pulses. She was fighting. She was still there, somewhere beneath the shadow of her father's presence. Reid knew he had seconds. He did the only thing he could think of. He ran toward her, and then he grabbed her by the shoulders. Lirena, he shouted. You are not him. Her body shuddered. I can't, he won't let go. Then make him. For a heartbeat, her eyes met his. Something shifted, and then the room collapsed. A massive shockwave erupted from her body, sending them both flying in opposite directions. Reid hit the ground hard, rolling through the debris. His vision swam. When he pushed himself up, he saw her. Lirena was floating. Not standing, floating. Suspended midair, her silver hair flowing wildly, her eyes burning with twin infernos of violet and white light. The ship itself seemed to bend around her presence, the very walls shifting as if reality itself were struggling to hold her in place. Her lips parted, and she screamed. The entire Drexera shook. Reid barely managed to shield his face as another explosion tore through the bulkheads, sending fire and debris spiraling in all directions. Then, silence. When the dust settled, she was on her knees, her breath ragged, and the violet glow in her eyes was gone. Reid staggered toward her. Lirena. She lifted her head slowly. He's gone, she whispered. Reid didn't speak. He only knelt beside her. Outside, the sounds of battle still raged. The Orion's wake was still fighting for them. But Reid knew. This was the real war. And it wasn't over yet. They didn't have time to recover. A voice crackled over Reid's wrist communicator. Captain, this is Corin. Orion's wake is taking heavy fire. We need you aboard now. Reid gritted his teeth. Understood. We're on our way. Lirena was still shaking, but she nodded. We have to finish this. Reid pulled her up. Then let's move. They sprinted through the crumbling corridors, dodging falling debris as the ship continued its slow, inevitable death. The battle outside was intensifying. Fighters streaked past the viewports in flashes of fire and light, the Dominion forces refusing to go down without a fight. But as they neared the hangar, a cold dread seeped into Reid's gut. Lirena suddenly stopped. Her breath hitched. Something's wrong. Reid turned sharply. What is it? She pressed a hand to her temple, her expression tightening. I don't know. A shadow fell over them. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, and from the smoke-choked corridors ahead, a figure emerged. Tall, clad in black, and his violet eyes, were still burning. Vorzith was standing there, whole and scathed, smiling. Did you really think you could kill me, daughter? Lirena's breath caught in her throat. Reid's hand tightened around his weapon. And then, the High Admiral laughed. Vorzith stood before them, a silhouette of perfect control amidst the chaos of his dying warship. Smoke curled around his form, his violet eyes gleaming with something ancient, something beyond the mortal. He had died. Reid had seen it with his own eyes, watched him unravel, consumed by his own fractured power. But now, the High Admiral was whole again, his black armor pristine, his expression laced with quiet amusement. Lirena trembled beside Reid, her breath shallow. He didn't need to look at her to know. She could feel it. The truth. He never left. Vorzith stepped forward, his boots silent against the ruined floor. "You felt it, didn't you?" he murmured. "The moment I faded. You thought you had won." His smile deepened. "But I have never been flesh alone, my dear." Lirena's hands clenched into fists. "You're a ghost." "A ghost?" He chuckled. "No, child. I am beyond the limitations of the body. Beyond time. Beyond death." He spread his arms, gesturing to the burning dreadnought around them. "This vessel, this empire, these were mere tools. But I—" His violet eyes darkened. "I am eternal." Reid stepped in front of Lirena, rifle raised. "Then let's test that theory." He fired. A clean shot, straight to the head, and it passed through him. The plasma bolt fizzled into nothingness the moment it touched Vorzith's form, as though he were made of mist and shadow. He didn't flinch, didn't react. Then he sighed. "Predictable, Captain." And with a flick of his wrist, Reid's body was thrown against the wall. Pain exploded through his ribs. His vision blurred as he hit the ground hard, his weapon skidding away into the darkness. Vorzith turned back to Lirena. "I told you," he said gently. "You are mine." Lirena stepped back, her breathing ragged. "No. Yes." He lifted his hand, and Lirena screamed. She clutched her head as waves of violet light surged from her body, raw and unstable. The metal beneath her cracked, the walls groaning under the weight of an unseen force. Vorzith tilted his head. "You feel it, don't you?" His voice was velvet soft. "The connection. The truth." Lirena gasped, shaking violently. "Get out." "You are not separate from me," Vorzith whispered. "You are a piece of me." Reid struggled to push himself up, his pulse hammering. "Lirena, don't listen to him." But her violet eyes were glowing again. Vorzith smiled. "Say it, child. Say it, and I will make the pain stop." Lirena's breath hitched. Her body trembled. Then, she stopped shaking. She exhaled. And then, softly, she whispered, "You are right." Reid's blood ran cold. Lirena straightened, her face unreadable. The energy swirling around her dimmed, controlled once more. Vorzith's smile widened. "Ah, finally you see." Lirena lifted her gaze to him, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she said slowly. "I see now." She stepped forward, and gently, she reached for his hand. Vorzith's fingers curled around hers, his expression victorious. "Good," he murmured. "Now let us begin." Then Lirena lunged. She drove her other hand into his chest, her fingers sinking through his incorporeal form, and gripped something that should not exist. Vorzith screamed. Lirena's eyes blazed with violet fire. "You made me from yourself," she whispered. "But that means I can tear you apart." A raw, splintering sound filled the air as her fingers twisted, pulling something out of him. Vorzith convulsed. His form flickered violently, the air around him warping as his essence fractured. "No," he rasped. "You don't understand." Lirena's grip tightened. "Yes, I do." And then, she ripped him from existence. Vorzith let out one final, distorted shriek before his form shattered into nothingness. For a long, terrible moment, the air itself burned with his absence. Then, silence. Lirena stood there, her breath slow and steady. Reid forced himself to his feet. "Lirena." She turned to him. Her violet eyes were dim once more. "It's over," she whispered. And then the Drexera began to fall apart. The dreadnought was collapsing. With Vorzith's destruction, whatever power had bound the ship together was now unraveling. Fire erupted from shattered conduits, entire decks caving in on themselves as explosions rocked the dying vessel. Reid grabbed Lirena's wrist. "We have to go now." She barely nodded before they broke into a sprint, dodging falling debris as they raced for the hangar. The corridors were failing, entire sections flickering in and out of stability. Over his comm, Corrin's voice crackled through. "Captain, we're running out of time. We can't hold our position. Just keep the engines warm." Reid snapped. The hangar doors loomed ahead. But just as they reached the threshold, the deck beneath them gave out. Reid barely had time to react before the floor collapsed, sending them plummeting into the abyss below. He twisted midair, grabbing onto a hanging support beam. Lirena. She fell, then stopped. Her body hovered midair, her power instinctively slowing her descent. For a second, they locked eyes. Then she reached up. "Take my hand." Reid didn't hesitate. Lirena's fingers wrapped around his, and she pulled. With one final surge of energy, they shot toward the hangar bay, landing hard against the deck. The Orion's wake was waiting. Corin and a handful of crew members were waving frantically from the boarding ramp. "Move!" Reid and Lirena ran. They dove onto the ship, just as the Drexra's final explosion erupted behind them. The force launched the Orion's wake forward. And then, they were free. The dreadnought imploded in the distance, a collapsing star of violet and fire, before vanishing into the abyss of space. In the silence that followed, Lirena exhaled shakily. "It's done," she whispered. Reid met her gaze. "Yeah." A long pause. Then she turned to the viewport, watching the burning wreckage of her past drift into oblivion. Reid stood beside her. Neither spoke. There were no words left. Only the endless stars before them, and the uncertain future waiting beyond.